Hello and welcome to this presentation on AC 3.3, which is entitled The Limitations of Agencies in Achieving Social Control. Now, we're getting down to the real nitty-gritty of the course here, and particularly the big mark questions for the exam. So when we come to the big 9 markers, they are evaluation style questions worth effectively a whole grade. So doing well in those and you do well overall. What we've got to look at is how you evaluate the agencies of social control. So we've looked at the police, the probation service, the CPS, the courts, etc., the prison service. We've looked at how they're financed, what their remit is, what they do, etc. Now we've got to evaluate whether they do an effective job or not. And in order to evaluate, you need to give the pros and cons of any argument that you're giving. And to help you with that, statistics, facts will help you with that. So I unashamedly have included lots of them in this PowerPoint. And my intention is that you go back over this PowerPoint and again, because this is the key one. This is the one where it shows what the problems are for, let's say, the police, the prison service, etc., in achieving social control. And if you understand what the problems are, then you can effectively evaluate whether or not they are doing a good job. So without further ado, let's make a start. So the first real limitation for agencies in achieving social control will come under the category of a repeat offending. Repeat offending is a real issue in this country, and so let's dive into this in a little detail. So obviously it stands to reason that if you don't rehabilitate an offender, they're going to continue to commit crime. And if that's the case, then you aren't achieving social control. So I've delved into the latest government statistics, which cover October to December 2020. The textbook statistics go back now 4 or 5 years. So you might want to consider looking at those, but at the same time, think about the latest statistics as well. And they suggest that the recidivism rates in this country are a major limitation to achieving social control. Although what I would say is they are decreasing. So that gives some grist to the mill to say, well, we've got high recidivism rates, but the trend is on the downward. So that is a good thing. So in the total recidivism rate for all offences, the total recidivism rates for all offences between October and December 2020 was 23.1%. Of which 22.7% were adults and 29.2% were juveniles. And on average, those who reoffended committed a further 3.6 offences each, and the number of reoffences per offender has been rising since 2009, but has recently just started to begin to decrease. So it's been on an upward trajectory. Now it's starting to dip slightly, and that is obviously a good thing. Adults released from custody or starting court orders have a reoffending rate of about 29.5%. So if you are in a court, if you have a court order or custody, 29.5% chance of reoffending, and it goes much further up if you look at shorter sentences, and this is really key here. So adults released from custodial sentences of less than 12 months had a proven reoffending rate of 54.9%, and if the sentences were less than or equal to 6 months, it was 56.5%. Now that to me says that short prison sentences are not effective in stopping people from reoffending. Longer ones appear to be slightly better. The reoffending rate's still not good, but it's much worse if it's a short prison sentence. Now there are lots of reasons why that might be the case. It might be that you don't think it's much of a deterrent, but it's probably more likely that people haven't had the chance to do any of the rehabilitative work with those prisoners who may suffer addiction, learning difficulties or whatever, or need to be trained up in skills. So as we go through this PowerPoint, you'll start to see how those ideas might emerge. So with all these things, we have to link through to our theories in Unit 2. So let's think about social learning theory here. Social learning theory might explain why there's high recidivism rates, because offenders learn and copy from others in the prison system. So prisoners become better criminals, they learn skills from others, and that then encourages them to continue offending upon release. So social learning theory might be one way you could explain why prisoners reoffend after they've been in prison, because they copy other prisoners. This is the reoffending rates. I said they've been dropping, so I've just got the most up-to-date figures. You can see in 2008-09 we were about 31.6 and it's plummeting to 25.6. Now, the only caveat I would give there is that's COVID. So not so many opportunities if we're in lockdown and the shops are closed to go thieving, etc. But you can make with that what you want. But certainly it is going down. So there is a downward spiral. That is a good thing. And so you could argue that perhaps the criminal justice system is getting better as reoffending rates are going down. So therefore it's starting to do its job. And if they continue to go down, that will be good. But they still remain over 25%. Data from 2016 showed that prisoners serving a sentence of less than 12 months had an offending rate of 64.5%. For the same period, offenders given a community sentence had a reoffending rate of 34%. Now, what does that show us? Well, that shows us that actually it looks as if community sentences are more effective in stopping reoffending than prison sentences. And there have been some people have been very highly critical of the message that will be sent by not imprisoning criminals. You know, if we go down the route of saying, well, we're just going to give community sentences, some people are not going to like that. But what is really clear, as we've seen from the previous slide, is that short sentences are definitely not deterring many offenders from crime. And what you can also add into the mix with that is that community sentences are also far cheaper. They're more cost effective. The most expensive community order is round about £5,000, and that's half the cost of imprisoning someone for 6 months, which is round about 11,000. So the number of community sentences also to consider has actually fallen over the last decades. So we're imprisoning more, doing less community service, and actually what it looks as if is that community service does a better job in stopping recidivism. So again, you might want to think about that in terms of your evaluation. And if we link that to theory, well, left realists would favour community sentences because they are better at addressing the causes of criminality and rehabilitating offenders. So things to think of. And I've just included this bar chart here, which shows the proportion of offenders who reoffend. So what you can see is you are less likely, the less offences you've been done for, the less likely you are to reoffend, is what it basically says. So also, you've got some people that are doing 11 or more previous offences. So that is your recidivists going backwards again and again and again, going through the system of prison, costing us money and never being rehabilitated. So it's something to think on there. Carrying on with our theme of repeat offending, well, obviously recidivism, if people keep reoffending, that's got the knock-on effect of increasing the prison population. Now that has more than doubled since 1993, but that has probably less of an impact on the prison population than the fact that courts are now giving longer sentences. So actually, why has our prison population gone through the roof? Well, there is reoffending, and that's obviously going to add to it, but actually we are giving out longer sentences in our courts, so that means more people are staying in prison. So for instance, to give you some grist to the mill, in 2012 the average sentence for an indictable offence was 14.9 months if you took them as an average. In 2021, 24.9, so nearly double. The average minimum sentence for murder has increased from 12.5 years in 2003 to 21.3 years in 2016. I couldn't find any stats on that. I think it's much the same though. So obviously it's inevitable that the prison population will rise given the above, and that is going to cost us money. And I've put this leaflet in here, so if you go on the link here, you can actually look at recommendations for sentencing on life in life imprisonment and how judges come up with the minimum term. So it's well worth a look. It's quite interesting. Now, once again, if I'm linking it to theory, well, right realists would say that prison works, although recidivism rates may suggest otherwise. So I've also dug out this government graph, which actually gives the projection of where our prison population is going to be. So you can see that's the data they've got, which is up to really December 2020, but they are predicting, so we're now in 2022 here, 23, around about 80,000. They are predicting that as we go up to March 26, it's going to be moving towards 99,000 people in prison. So the prison population isn't coming down in the near future at all. So as these longer sentences are brought in, this is the impact that it's going to have on the prison system. And of course, if you've got more people in the prison system and you don't raise the staff and you don't provide the facilities, then it's very difficult to rehabilitate people because you haven't got the capacity to give them the education, the drug treatment, the alcohol treatment, the anger management courses and the skills that they need. So again, something to consider there. So who does the reoffending? Well, as you saw in that bar chart I gave you earlier on, the more previous convictions someone has, the more likely they are to reoffend. So in 2017, 49.3% of offenders who had more than 10 convictions offended again. So clearly we weren't doing the business with them. Offenders who serve a prison sentence, as we know, are more likely to reoffend than those who receive a warning, fine or a community sentence. And males are more likely to reoffend than females. And those with drug or alcohol addictions, the homeless, fewer qualifications and the unemployed are also more likely to reoffend. Now, all these figures that I've been giving you are all from the government's proven reoffending statistics. And the reality is, it's likely that there's much more reoffending that's gone undetected and unpunished. So quite likely our reoffending statistics are higher than those that are officially published. So that's something to remember. But if we link all this to theory, well, Marxists wouldn't be surprised in the least that unemployed offenders are more likely to reoffend because they've had little chance to meet their needs if they have to survive solely on benefits in an unequal capitalist society. So again, Marxism will give that reason for why people reoffend. So having looked at repeat offending as a limitation of agencies in achieving social control, our next category would be civil liberties and legal barriers. Now, civil liberties are our basic rights and freedoms that as citizens in a democratic country we are entitled to through law. So they include things like freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of assembly and association, so I can go out and protest if I want, if I do it peacefully. I can associate with who I want, providing I'm not breaking the law. Freedom of religion and conscience, freedom from detention without trial, the right to privacy. Now, those are our basic freedoms. However, all of these are linked to this idea of the due process model of criminal justice that we examine in AC 1.3. For example, freedom from arbitrary arrest, where the police can arrest anyone they wish, or freedom from detention without trial, where you can be held in custody indefinitely without being brought before a court. They're important protections for the individual against the state's abuse of power. Now, obviously, the legal processes involved in due process are a limitation to the state exercising control over its citizens without good cause. So it is a barrier to social control, due process. I would say it's a good barrier, but some may not. So we link that to theory. Marxists would suggest that laws are necessary to prevent the working class from the ruling elite, to protect the proletariat from the bourgeoisie. So how can I illustrate how this due process model might be a barrier to or a limitation to agencies achieving social control? Well, we can use the case study of Abu Qatada, this man down here. Now, in 2012, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the UK could not deport Abu Qatada, who the UK had branded as a hate preacher, to Jordan because of the risk he would be tried on evidence obtained by torture. Theresa May, who was then the Home Secretary, said that the radical Islamist cleric would have been sent back to his native country of Jordan long before, had the European Court of Human Rights not moved the goalposts by establishing new legal grounds for blocking his deportation. He was eventually deported in 2013, but he'd actually been in the country since 1993, having claimed asylum on a forged passport. He was repeatedly imprisoned and then released. He was detained under anti-terrorist laws in 2002. He was never prosecuted for any crime in the UK, but we were trying to get him out of the country basically since 1993, and we didn't manage to do that till 2013. Now, there's various views on Abu Qatada. All I will say is that when he did eventually go back to Jordan, remember, we were worried about the fact that he would be convicted on evidence obtained by torture. When he went back to Jordan, he was actually found innocent in a court in Jordan. So make of that what you will. But this is, in Theresa May's and the government's mind, a Islamist radical hate preacher who they wanted to deport from the country, but the due process didn't allow them to do that. Now, you may think that is a good thing, you may think that is a bad thing, that is up to you, but it's a good case study to use. So, that was civil liberties and legal barriers. Now we move on to access to resources and support. Now this is a biggie, so let's go through it in detail. So obviously, if you are an offender and you're in prison or you're serving a community service order or whatever, you need resources and support to help you rehabilitate it. If the resources and support are limited, the prisoner's ability to rehabilitate is also going to be limited too. And that is therefore going to have the knock-on effect of limiting social control. Now, if we take prisons, there are a number of reasons why prisons fail to rehabilitate offenders. For instance, we've already looked at short sentences. They've got a really poor recidivism rate. Why? Well, it could be they don't give sufficient time to do the intensive work needed to address those deep-seated problems such as drug dependency, illiteracy, anger management. And of course, the problem is made worse by the fact there are a limited number of places on appropriate courses. And of course, if you're on a short prison sentence and you're on a waiting list, you're going to be out of prison before you can get on that course that you need to go on to rehabilitate you. There's also inadequate resources for education and training. Now, in 2020, 2/3 of prisons were judged by Ofsted as requiring improvement or inadequate for learning and skills. Research by the Ministry of Justice found that people who participated in education whilst in prison were significantly less likely to reoffend within 12 months of release than those who had not, by 7.5 points. So we've got basically inadequate provision for education, but at the same time we're saying that if you do manage to get education, you are less likely to reoffend. So worth thinking about that. And here's a really useful stat for you. 51% of people entering prison have the literacy skills expected of an 11-year-old. Now, in the general population, it's only 15%. So it's massively skewed within the prison system. So you've got people that are illiterate, struggling to access programs, struggling to access education, and yet our prison education is graded as inadequate. There's some good things that do come out of it, but it's certainly not as good as it could be. And that's something that I would be thinking about as I evaluate the prison system. So carrying on with access to resources and support, obviously We know that there's issues in prison with education, but there has been a 15% cut in the number of prison officers, and that obviously means there are fewer people to supervise prisoner activities that would help with their rehabilitation. Now, at the same time, let's not forget also the prison, you had a 50% reduction in officers. At the same time, the prison population has doubled. So you've got more prisoners, less officers. So education is going to suffer, because the only way you can supervise those people is bang them up in their cells for 23 hours a day. That leads me on to release on temporary licence. And that is a scheme that's intended to allow trusted prisoners out of prison on day release or overnight to attend training, employment, job interviews. And that's a good scheme, but the reality is very few are able to take advantage of this scheme because there aren't the staff to supervise it because of the reduction in staff. So you could argue that's not the prison officers' fault or the prison services' fault, the reduction in staff and the increase in numbers in prisoners, but they're basically presented with a perfect storm where they can do nothing about it. So again, have a think on that one. So when a prisoner is released on licence to serve the rest of their sentence in the community, we're now not talking about temporary licence, we're now saying they're out on licence, they're out on parole, under the supervision of the probation service, they still encounter many problems. Lack of money, prisoners are released with £46 discharge grant on their release. Only a quarter of prisoners have a job to go to on release. So, and 1 in 9 prisoners has no accommodation to go to upon release. And you lose housing benefit if you spend more than 13 weeks in prison. So if you are in a tenancy, you are being paid for by the council. If you've spent more than 30 weeks in prison, that place is gone and you'd have to reapply for benefit and find somewhere new to live. And you've got 46 quid in your pocket to help you do that. So if we want a case study for this, we have looked at this before, but we're going to look at again. The End Friday Releases campaign is a perfect one to look at, and it's also a really good one for pressure group campaigns. So you can use it for 2 different ACs. Over a third of all releases from prison happen on a Friday. Charities and pressure groups such as NACRO and the Howard League for Penal Reform have supported a big campaign to end Friday releases from prison. Being released on a Friday could mean a race against the clock to access services such as accommodation, drug, medication and benefits before the weekend shutdown. So, here's your to-do list on a Friday: leave prison, get trained to Central Bedford tonight, ask counsel, meet job support person, go to the doctor with the GP, meet the probation officer, register for benefits and email, find computer and library. All those things you've got to do on a Friday with 46 quid, and you've got a limited time to do it because on the Saturday all those will have closed down. So this can result in people having to obviously sleep rough, survive on their discharge grant until services reopen on Monday. This then leaves them very vulnerable to reoffending in some cases, simply just to put a roof over their heads for the night. So what is unsurprising here is that some ex-prisoners quickly breach the conditions of their licence and therefore are recalled to prison as a result to serve the remainder of their sentence. So boosting the prison system again. There is a link to the End Friday Releases campaign. But what I would say is there's some good news, because as I speak, in December 2022, the government is starting the process to introduce a new law to significantly reduce Friday releases from prisons. So there's some good stuff happening, and hopefully next year, 2023, a law will come in that will significantly reduce Friday releases from prison. So let's again, so we looked at prisons, let's look at community sentences now. So whilst we know that community sentences are more successful than prison in reducing recidivism, they're not without their problems, and there's a number of reasons for this as well. So there are some barriers. So there's inadequate support for complex needs such as drug addiction, mental health problems and homelessness. And there are limited places on specialist programs to address such needs. In my next slide, I'm going to show you some stats I found on the probation service and drug treatment programs. There's inadequate supervision by probation service because they've been criticised that their service is too lax in allowing offenders to miss supervision appointments, and of course there have been the failures by the CRCs, the privatised community rehabilitation companies, who have been heavily criticised for not meeting their targets, poor supervision of offenders, in some cases even supervising their clients remotely by telephone. And we know that the CRCs were effectively abolished under the reformation of the probation service in 2021. So let's look at these community sentences, and particularly drug treatment. You can use this as a case study. In 2021, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Probation estimated that almost 75,000 of the 156,000 under supervision by the probation service had a drug problem. So nearly just under half of people that the probation service was supervising had a drug problem. Yet fewer than 3,000 of those were referred by services to specialist drug misuse treatment. So you've got 75,000 people with a drug problem and only 3,000 are referred for drug misuse treatment. Make of that what you will. And the Inspectorate of Probation with the Care Quality Commission, they got together to examine how the probation service supervised this cohort, and their conclusion was probation service is responding poorly to drug misuse and addiction cases. So some of those community sentences of getting drug treatment have not been effective, and the right people aren't getting access to the right courses. So that is another issue. This then leads us on to finance. We've touched on this before in previous PowerPoints. Well, public sector finance is limited. Cuts in budget are obviously going to impact on the effectiveness of agencies in achieving social control. And here are some of the lists of some of the cuts that have been made to agencies. So the police between 2010 and 2014 had their budget cut by 19% and their numbers reduced by 20,000. The CPF between 2010 and 2018 had their budget cut by 25% and their staff reduced by a third. And prisons, as we said before, budget fell by 60%, staff levels by 15%. The worst prison riot in 25 years took place in privately owned Birmingham Prison, which is now back under public control, and of course at the same time the prison population doubled. So let's have a look at that. Less police on the streets to catch the criminals, less people in the CPS, which means that it'll take longer to get cases through court because there are less staff. That means that if people are on remand, they're on remand longer, which means the prison system, the people in prison, there's going to be more people in prison. And of course, we've then got lack of increase in the number of prisoners in prison and decline in staff, which means you can't supervise education, which is then going to lead to a rise in recidivism rates. And of course, the probation service report highlighted the following problems of staff shortages, the substandard performance of CRCs, and the shortcomings in keeping victims safe, even though, as we know, CRCs were scrapped in 2021. Also, another limitation is local and national policies. So they can limit agencies in an interesting way, I would say. So national local policies limit the ability of agencies such as the police to achieve social control, because when a new law makes a particular crime into a priority, it's likely to mean that other offences are neglected to some extent as the police focus on the priority. And at the same time, it's also been suggested that police focus on trivial crime instead of serious offences in order to meet government targets, but make of that what you will. So examples of this would be, so from 2010 to 2015, the government promoted a policy to tackle knife, gun and gang crime. So the police would spend a lot of time focusing on that. And if you're focusing on that, something else has got to give, which means that other crimes are going unreported or undetected or not looked into or unprosecuted, which means that social control isn't occurring. In 2017, the head of the CPS said they wanted to crack down on social media hate crimes. So again, the police were moved into looking at that. But of course, as we know, looking to social media, there's lots of, with technology, the rise in technology, previous PowerPoint went into this, gives all sorts of issues in terms of man hours used to scroll through phones, data, hard disks, etc. Now, some of the priorities of the different police forces around the country are set nationally by the Home Office, but others will be set locally in response to local needs. For example, we've already mentioned knife crime, but where knife crime is particularly high, police may respond with extra measures such as increased stop and searches. But an example of something that's worked well for a local priority would be weapon amnesties. So from time to time, local police forces hold amnesties where they won't arrest people who surrender illegal weapons. A 2-week gun amnesty in London in 2017 led to 350 firearms and 40,000 rounds of ammunition being handed in. So that's got to be a good thing, I would argue. And then finally, another limitation we come to is crimes committed by those with moral imperatives. Now, the moral imperative is a strongly felt principle, an overriding sense of what's right. So you could argue, I think, assisted suicide could be used as an example here. It's illegal in this country, but many people feel that it's perfectly acceptable. If you're dying from incurable disease, you should be allowed to take your own life. So moral imperatives may compel a person to act to uphold their beliefs, even if it means breaking the law. Now, I've got some examples, but actually a recent example could be the Insulate Britain campaign, or the people that are gluing themselves to the M25 to try and stop diesel emissions. But I'm going to use these people here. So you can use Kay Gilderdale. Now, I've talked already about assisted suicide. She assisted in the suicide of her daughter, who'd been seriously ill for 17 years. She was acquitted of murder by a jury. This man here, Alan Blythe, he was charged with cultivated cannabis with intent to supply. He did so in order to provide it for his terminally ill wife to relieve her pain. The jury found him not guilty of supply, but guilty of possession. So what do these show? These cases show it can be difficult to persuade juries to control the actions of those they see as acting morally. So, technically, was she guilty of murder? Well, under law, Kay Gilderdale was, but was found innocent by a jury. Was he guilty of cultivated cannabis? Well, technically he was under law, but the jury still found him innocent. So there you go. Crimes of those with moral imperatives. And of course, this links to functionalist theory, which suggests that crime has a positive function within society. So cases such as Kay Gilderdale's may produce boundary maintenance by showing what's acceptable within society. So this is where the majority of the right-minded, law-abiding members of society would reaffirm their values and produce social solidarity. And another classic example that we can use is the case of the suffragettes. They campaigned for women's right to vote in the early 20th century. They did it through direct action, civil disobedience. They deliberately broke the law. They set fire to post boxes, smashed windows of public buildings, cut telegraph wires, and when convicted, refused to pay fines. Their crimes were motivated by moral imperatives to force government to change the law and give women the vote. About 1,000 women were imprisoned, and then when they were imprisoned, they then went on hunger strike. And in 1913, the government responded by passing the Prisoners Act, commonly known as the Cat and Mouse Act, because, like a cat playing with a mouse, it allowed hunger strikers to be temporarily released, but then re-imprisoned once they'd recovered their health. And of course, as more and more suffragists refused food in prison, the authorities began force feeding through the nostril or stomach tube, in many cases causing permanent health problems. There's an example of it. The suffragettes eventually got a partial victory in 1918. Vote was given to the women over 30. Finally, in 28, it was equalised at 21 for both sexes. So again, we can link that through to functionalism, which would argue that without deviant acts such as the above, social change wouldn't occur, and injustices such as the inequality between sexes would remain. So that concludes this PowerPoint on the limitations of agencies. So repeat offending, civil liberties and legal barriers, access to resource and support, finance, local and national policies, and crime committed by those with moral imperatives. Again, go back over it, get the stats going, get some ideas in your head, and think about how things work out, why various agencies can or can't achieve social control. And I'll see you for our final PowerPoint of the course shortly. Goodbye.